guys, welcome to Reading Realm. Last video I recorded a book review where I talked about a character who had Down syndrome, and in doing so I mentioned the fact that I am autistic. And because of that, I figured that the next of the 7 books I am reviewing today, it would be fitting to review a book about autism. And I actually 8 books. I'm reviewing 8 books today. One of them I do not have with me. Basically, some backstory to how I found this book was I was diagnosed with autism when I was in 8th grade. I have autism and I have ADHD. And the thing about that was the person who diagnosed me told me and my parents, you have these conditions. And that was pretty much it. And so going through school and life, none of us knew what that meant or what that was or how that made me different than anyone else in my life that I would interact with. And because of that, I struggled with a lot of things, a lot more than I should have had to, just because I didn't know what was wrong in a way that I could communicate it. And when I tried to communicate some things, I was accused of making stuff up to try to skip school or to try to get out of things or just for attention, which is not what I was doing. And it was like that all through high school for me. I struggled a lot academically. I struggled a lot at just dealing with how I felt physically. And a couple of years ago, I started to kind of learn things for myself about autism and ADHD. And I would see something and I would realize that I related to it. And then I would see something else and I would be like, that explains so much. For example, when I was sick all the time during high school, I wasn't faking and I wasn't trying to make up excuses to stay home. I was in really intense autistic burnout for months on end, and it was making me physically sick. But doctors never found anything wrong because for some reason either they didn't know that was a thing or they didn't know I was autistic, and I didn't know that that could have been due to autism, so I didn't know how to communicate it. Anyway, basically, what that meant was that a few months ago, I decided I've been learning all of these things, and they've been very helpful to me, but I really would like my parents to understand more about who I am and how I function or don't function, and what I need to be able to function or do well. And I need to figure out how to communicate that to them. And so it was getting close to the holidays, and I decided I was going to go buy books on autism, read through them, highlight them, and annotate them based on my own thoughts and experiences, and then give them to them. I have not finished all of that, so I have given them all the books and then told them I'm taking these back to finish highlighting and annotating. But they have 2 now that I've finished. One of them I loved so much that I bought for myself, and that is the book that I'm going to be reviewing today. This book is The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida, and this book, not only do I think it represents a very good insight to being autistic, it also is very impressive because this book was written by a 13-year-old boy who who is nonverbal autistic. And I'm not nonverbal, as you can tell, because I've been talking. But communication is difficult for autistic people, regardless of whether they can't speak, whether they have limited speech, or whether they can hold conversations. There are always things that they'll struggle with a little bit more than allistic people. And for those who don't know, allistic is the term for people who are not autistic. This book, it was originally in Japanese, and it was written when this boy would point out on a hiragana chart of Japanese characters to spell out words to write this whole book, and someone helped him to transcribe it. And it's basically a series of questions that are being asked about his experience as an autistic person and him responding to them. For example, asking, do you find childish language easier to understand? And he basically was saying, I don't appreciate being talked to like a child. I might need extra help, but don't talk to me like I'm stupid unless I ask you to. And I think that is really something that I think that all autistic people, or probably all people in general, feel. Don't assume that we're less intelligent just because we have a disability. Unless we ask you to really simplify something, or unless we ask to be treated a certain way, don't assume that it's how we want to be treated. Another thing that I think is really important about this book, again, I think that all of his responses are very, very good. And I think that some don't apply to me because I'm 23. That's 10 years older than he was when he wrote this. And some of these things do apply a little bit more to childhood autism, or apply to fully nonverbal autism, which I personally have not experienced. And so some of them I didn't relate to quite as much, but I think that a lot of it has a really good insight into his world, as well as the world of a lot of autistic people. And even though I didn't relate to everything, there was still a lot that I did relate to, and that I did end up highlighting or annotating for my parents in the copy that I gave them. And I think that another really important thing is that this book, in the introduction, was written by one of the translators of this book, who is the father of an autistic child. And he takes the reader through an exercise trying to imagine what it's like to be autistic. And I read that part aloud to my parents because it really stuck out to me. And after I finished reading it to them, they both thought about it for a second and they didn't know what to say, because it really put into perspective how much more difficult some things are for me than for them in ways that they could never really imagine. Because I don't think neurotypical people or allistic people will ever fully understand what it's like to be autistic, just in the same way that I wouldn't ever fully understand what it's like to be neurotypical or to be any other disability. My sister has dyslexia, and I don't understand exactly what she experiences with that. And even though my sister, myself, and my dad all have ADHD, we all experience that a little bit differently. And so I think that trying to get more insight and understanding into disabilities, even if you think you know what that disability is or how it works, I think is really good. Just because there's a lot about autism that I think is falsely represented, and because of that, it makes things very difficult for autistic people. And I know that this is supposed to be about this book specifically, but he does talk about how sometimes people will treat him in a way because they think that that's how he should be treated, or how he wants to be treated, or how he needs to be treated, when in fact it might be causing more problems for him. And one of the things that he repeats a lot throughout this is just autistic people are hurting. When they're having a tantrum or being loud or not being in control of themselves, they probably know that they are not doing something, or they are doing something they shouldn't be. And they probably know that it's bothering people, but they can't control it, and they need help, and they need understanding, and they need kindness. And he repeats that a lot about various different things, about just be patient, just try to be there for us, just try to understand. And I think that that's such an important part of understanding any person who is different. Doesn't matter whether it's a disability or a cultural difference, just being patient and being understanding. And I think especially for people with a disability that can make communication more difficult, take the time to really listen to them if they feel comfortable or safe opening up and talking about it, because that is probably a challenge for them. That is probably something that is taking them a lot more effort than it would take you to talk about the same kind of thing. And so I genuinely think that this book is incredible. I think just the way that it was written, and the fact that this person who was nonverbal and didn't really have a way to communicate very easily was able to write this whole book that was able to share with others his experiences and his feelings, I think was so interesting to read, especially because in addition to him being nonverbal and also younger than I am, he's also Japanese, which I think is interesting because you can see some of the influence of Japanese culture on what he writes about. For example, nature is a huge thing in Japanese culture, and he talks about that. He talks about how autistic people might notice things slightly differently in the pattern of leaves or something like that. And it's just so fascinating to read about. And I think it's also really interesting because I learned that the Japanese word for autism, I don't know how to pronounce it because it doesn't say that here, but it says that the characters that spell that word in Japanese stand for self-shut illness, which I think is really interesting because there is kind of this stereotype that autistic people are like locked away inside themselves in a way, or they're so different that they don't really fit in, which I do think, at least from my own experience, I have definitely had difficulties fitting in and still do. But I also personally don't see it as an illness. I see it as a disability. It affects every day of my life, and it makes a lot of things more difficult. But it's also a part of who I am and how I am. And even though it makes things a lot more difficult in a lot of ways, I don't want a cure for it. I want awareness and acceptance from others more than I want myself to be fixed. And I know that is a sentiment that some other autistic people share. I cannot speak for everyone, and I don't intend to, but I do think that that is very interesting to learn about that etymology in Japanese. I have studied some Japanese, but I have never learned that word in any of my classes. But there was another part that I'm trying to find because I thought that it was really interesting after this part about the description of trying to explain what is happening in an autistic person's mind, because it talks about how, and this is not the 13-year-old's words, this is in the introduction, but he talks about trying to process sensory input is something that neurotypical people are able to do. They can tune stuff out, they can kind of control things. And autistic people, it's like being in a room with 30 radios all blaring at you. And you can't really regulate sensory stuff, so it's easy to get overwhelmed. And then you have these other kind of sensory editors, or even just how you behave kind of editors, and they all just leave. That's how he explained it, as trying to imagine what it's like. And I think it is true. To some extent, again, I don't understand what it's like to be neurotypical, so I don't know what you don't hear or what you can tune out. But right now I hear a lot of noises in here, and they're probably not getting picked up on the microphone of what I'm recording, but they are here, and I can hear all of them at once. I can't really block out that. But one of the things that I thought was really nice of the person writing the introduction was he wrote, this was talking about dealing with the reality of being autistic and these kind of, he described it as basically being in some sort of warped reality in a sci-fi film. But he said basically films end, but autism is lifelong. But later after he wrote about how, like, now that you've thought about what that would be like, he says, it is an intellectual and emotional task of Herculean, Sisyphean, and Titanic proportions, and if the autistic people who undertake it aren't heroes, then I don't know what heroism is. Never mind that the heroes have no choice. And I really liked that, because I think there's so much negative stigma and stereotypes about autistic people that just felt so positive and so, like, what's even the word? Like, giving credit for how difficult things can be and what we go through. And I really appreciated that, because I feel like that isn't something that's very well understood or appreciated by the general public. I do know there are people who do know, and do their best to support people, but overall as a society, I think it is very misunderstood and very stigmatized. But this book, the reason I jump, I love the cover of it. And the reason I jumped, that is one of the questions that he answers in this book, that title. So that's where that comes from. Some of the other questions that it mentions on the back are, why do people with autism talk so loudly and weirdly? Why don't you make eye contact when you're talking? And what's the reason you jump? And so he's sharing his insight into both his experience with autism, but also just kind of his life. And in between and at the end, there are actually little short stories that he wrote. And one of them, which I really personally like, is basically a retelling of The Tortoise and the Hare, but the tortoise falls over right at the beginning of the race, and all of his friends take him home and put him to bed and make sure that he's okay. And then the hare gets to the finish line and no one's there to wait and celebrate. So it's just a little short story, but I really liked it. I thought it was really sweet, and it's so interesting to see not only the answers to these questions that are being directly asked, but also just kind of his own creativity of his own kind of moral of the story kind of thing, because normally the moral of that story is you don't have to rush things and you can go slow and still succeed. But in his version, it's more like, if you're obsessed with winning and don't care if your friend gets hurt, no one's gonna support you. But yes, the reason I jumped, I really loved that book. I thought it was very, very emotional to read sometimes for me, just because it did resonate with me in some ways about things that I struggled with and things that I realized I should have known. Someone should have told me, either the person who diagnosed me or someone else. Why did no one tell me? It would have made my life so much easier. So even if it's not this book, I highly recommend, if you are autistic, if you know someone autistic, or if one of your family members is autistic or your close friends, I highly recommend reading about it. Try to find reputable sources to learn about it. One of the things that I personally advocate for is try to go to books that are by autistic people rather than by psychologists, because I know that there are psychologists who do have good insight and good information, but again, if they're not autistic, they'll never really understand what it's like and how it feels. They might understand it from a neurological perspective, but that isn't really the same thing as experience. And I think another thing that I personally have seen is a lot of times psychologists discuss it more from the perspective of, here's what you can do to alleviate the symptoms or try to cure it. It's not curable, but how to kind of suppress it or function in society. And if you read things from autistic people, it's a lot more, how can society adapt to accommodate autistic people, which I think is more important in my opinion, just because I think autistic people are autistic. That is how they are, that is how they function, that is how they live every day. And a lot of autistic people already mask to fit into society or to fit into social norms or to fit into social situations. and asking the autistic people to put all of their responsibility of managing how they are autistic is unfair when we should be asking society how to accommodate autistic people. Anyway, I think I'm going to end this here with that to think about. I highly, highly, highly recommend this book. I know it's not the same as a lot that I've reviewed just because it is nonfiction and it is about a specific disability, but I think that awareness for different disabilities is important, especially as someone with this disability and someone who has encountered a lot of people who believe incorrect or inaccurate information, or believe that just because one autistic person is one way means all autistic people are that way. That's not true. Autistic people vary a lot. Autism is a spectrum. Autism has a lot of different symptoms and different ways it can express itself, and some people have a worse time, sometimes people have an easier time, but even within that, there is a range of what autistic people are actually capable of day to day as well. And I think that's important because then people will understand not to have these super high expectations, even if someone is high functioning, which is a term that I do not like, but unfortunately is a big part of descriptions for autistic people. I have another autism book that I will be reviewing, which in the title of the book talks about why you shouldn't call it high functioning. So I'll be talking more about that then. But for now, thank you so much. If you read this book, please let me know what you thought. Please show your support to the autistic people in your life, if you know any, or even if you don't. Just try to be kind to people who are different than you in ways both mental, physical, cultural, anything. Just be nicer. I think one of the things that this author talks about a lot is just wanting people to be nice in the world, and I think that's a good message. And if a 13-year-old non-verbal autistic boy is able to tell you that, you should listen, because that took a lot of effort to say. But that is my review of The Reason I Jump. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it, and keep reading. Bye!